Welcome back to Little Mizzlewick, where the allotments are rarely as peaceful as they first appear. Tonight's story, The Little Mizzlewick Pepper Panic, begins with Ben Carter, a packet of alarmingly hot chili seeds, and the firm belief that modern research can outdo village gardening wisdom. As the rows of beans and courgettes look on, Little Mizzlewick prepares to offer advice, encouragement, and just a little more help than any pepper plant should reasonably need.
The bold beginning. The morning mist clung to the allotments like a shy promise, threading between the neat rows of runner beans and courgette plants that stretched across Little Mizzlewick's communal growing ground. Ben Carter stood at the gate, flexing his fingers in brand new leather gardening gloves, surveying his modest plot with the satisfied air of a general reviewing his troops. The plot wasn't much to look at yet, a rectangle of dark earth bordered by string lines. But Ben had plans, big plans. Right then, he announced to nobody in particular, though June Marsh was deadheading her roses 3 plots over, and Eleanor Vance was examining her potato leaves with scientific intensity. Time to show you country folk how it's done. June's secateurs paused mid-snip, Eleanor's head tilted slightly, the way a sparrow might cock its ear toward an interesting sound. Ben reached into his canvas bag and withdrew a collection of seed packets with the reverence of a priest handling sacred texts. But these weren't ordinary seeds. The packets bore names like Carolina Reaper, Ghost Pepper, and something called Satan's Blood Supreme that had cost him nearly £20 online. The illustrations showed peppers so red they seemed to glow with malevolent intent. I'm going to grow, Ben declared, holding up the packets so the early sun caught their glossy surfaces, the hottest chili peppers in England. The morning seemed to pause. A blackbird stopped mid-song. Even the breeze held its breath. June straightened from her roses, her face carefully neutral in the way village people perfected when witnessing something that would provide excellent gossip material for weeks. Chilies, is it? She said mildly. Not just any chilies, Ben continued, warming to his theme. These beauties can hit over 2 million on the Scoville scale. That's military-grade heat. I'll be entering them in the Allotment Society chili cook-off, naturally. Eleanor emerged from behind her potato plants, adjusting her reading glasses. 2 million Scoville units, she repeated thoughtfully. That's ambitious. Ambitious is my middle name. Ben grinned, then caught himself. Well, actually, it's William, but you know what I mean. From the neighbouring plot, Major Burns looked up from where he'd been measuring the distance between his onion sets with a ruler. His moustache twitched in what might have been amusement. Cook off, you say? Planning to poison the entire village, Carter? Planning to win? Ben shot back cheerfully. These London taste buds have been trained on the spiciest food the capital can offer. Brick Lane vindaloos, Zequan hot pots, that sort of thing. I reckon Little Mizzlewick's ready for a proper challenge. June exchanged a glance with Eleanor that contained volumes of unspoken communication. It was the sort of look that passed between villagers when they witnessed a newcomer announcing they knew better than generations of local wisdom. Well, June said, her tone as sweet as her prize-winning strawberry jam. That'll be interesting. Ben was already kneeling beside his plot, tearing open the first packet with enthusiasm. The seeds were tiny, innocent-looking things, dark and wrinkled like miniature raisins. Hard to believe something so small could bring grown men to tears. He'd done his research, or at least watched enough late-night YouTube videos to think he had. The secret, he explained to his growing audience, because somehow half the allotment holders had appeared as if summoned by some invisible signal, is starting them early and giving them exactly what they need. Temperature, humidity, the right soil pH. It's all about precision. Tom Armitage leaned on his spade, a smile playing around his weather-beaten features. Precision, eh? That's one way to look at it. The only way, Ben said firmly, consulting his notebook. I've got it all worked out. Germination temperature of 26 degrees Celsius, transplanting at 6 weeks, hardening off period of 10 days minimum, Science, not guesswork. Arthur Grimshaw, who'd wandered over from the pub with a wheelbarrow full of compost, scratched his chin thoughtfully. My grandfather always said gardening was more art than science. Something about listening to what the plants wanted. Ben looked up from his seed trays, a patronising smile on his face. With respect, Arthur, your grandfather didn't have access to modern horticultural research. We know so much more now about optimal growing conditions, nutrient uptake, genetic expression. It's all about data. The assembled villagers absorbed this pronouncement with the stoic patience of people who'd been growing things since before Ben had learned to walk. They watched as he arranged his seed trays with mathematical accuracy, consulted his charts and began planting each seed exactly 2 centimetres apart and 1 centimetre deep, measuring carefully with a ruler. There, Ben said, straightening up with satisfaction. Carolina Reapers, Ghost Peppers, and Satan's Blood Supreme. In 12 weeks, I'll have the hottest chilies this village has ever seen. By evening, word had reached the Shepherd's Crook, delivered with the usual efficiency of village gossip that had started the moment Nora Field heard about Ben's intention and raised a knowing eyebrow. Sarah Logan was holding forth about Ben's announcement to an appreciative audience. 2 million Scoville units, she repeated for the 3rd time, shaking her head. That's not food, that's a weapon. Arthur polished glasses behind the bar, listening to the speculation with the satisfied air of someone who'd seen it all before. Newcomers always wanted to prove themselves, and the village had its own gentle ways of teaching lessons. Ben Carter was about to get an education in the most generous, well-meaning, catastrophically helpful way possible. Outside, the allotments lay quiet under the stars, the seed trays sitting in their neat rows, waiting for the morning sun. In 12 weeks, Ben would indeed have chilies. The question wasn't whether they'd be hot enough to win the competition. The question was whether anyone would survive the tasting. Sarah's bulletin had reached Alfie Crane on his way home, and Alfie had passed it on to nobody at all, because Alfie never passed things on. He did, however, make a point of walking slightly more slowly past Ben's plot on his rounds the following morning, and spent a thoughtful moment examining the seed trays with the expression of a man quietly updating his expectations. The Advice Gauntlet, the first assault on Ben's confidence, came at 06:30 hours precisely, delivered with the sort of military punctuality that had made Major Robert Burns the terror of 3 different regiments, and, more recently, the despair of postmen who dared arrive after 9 o'clock. Ben was kneeling beside his seed trays, consulting his smartphone app that promised to monitor germination progress through advanced algorithmic analysis, when a shadow fell across his plot. He looked up to find the Major standing at attention, hands clasped behind his back, inspecting Ben's handiwork with the intensity of a drill sergeant reviewing a suspect rifle. "Carter!" the Major barked, causing Ben to nearly drop his phone. "What's your watering protocol?" Before Ben could answer, the Major had produced a battered notebook from his jacket pocket, its pages filled with military neat handwriting and what appeared to be battle plans for vegetables. 0600 hours, the Major read aloud, stabbing the page with his finger. First watering, measured to the milliliter, not a drop more, not a drop less. Temperature, ambient, plus 2 degrees. Duration, precisely 45 seconds per tray. Ben opened his mouth. "Per tray, Carter, not per session, per tray." By the time the Major had finished his lecture, Ben's smartphone app had been dismissed as civilian nonsense. His casual watering can replaced with a military surplus measuring jug, and his relaxed approach overhauled with a schedule that would have impressed the Royal Marines. The Major had also produced, from somewhere inside his tweed jacket, a laminated card detailing contingency watering protocols in the event of cloud cover, unexpected frost, or what he referred to, without further elaboration, as pepper insurgency. Ben found himself stumbling through pre-dawn darkness the next morning, armed with his measuring jug and a military-grade stopwatch. At precisely 600, he began his first regimented watering, counting out 45 seconds per tray, while his breath formed clouds in the cold air. "One Mississippi, 2 Mississippi," he whispered, feeling slightly ridiculous, but determined to prove he could match the Major's standards. He kept it up for 3 mornings before he stopped setting the alarm with quite such optimism and started setting it with something closer to grim acceptance. By the 4th morning, the measuring jug had become simply part of the routine, like the stopwatch, the laminated card, and the increasingly complicated relationship he was developing with the concept of sleep. The second wave of helpful advice arrived 3 days later, delivered with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing state secrets. June Marsh approached with the stealth of a woman who'd spent decades perfecting the art of village intelligence gathering. "Ben," she said, glancing around as though checking for enemy agents, "I've been watching your seedlings. What you need is the secret ingredient that's been in my family for generations." She reached into her gardening bag and withdrew 2 glass jars filled with something that looked like muddy water mixed with... Ben preferred not to speculate. The contents were dark, mysterious, and emanated a smell that made his eyes water. "My grandmother's recipe," June whispered, holding up the jars like precious artefacts from 1943, during the war. This mixture made tomatoes the size of melons, courgettes like cricket bats, but you mustn't tell anyone the secret ingredient. Ben, who had by this point been awake since before dawn for 4 consecutive days and had developed a genuinely complicated relationship with a laminated card, accepted the jars with the gratitude of a man who had stopped asking questions. June watched him tuck the jars carefully into his bag with the satisfied expression of someone who has done their civic duty. She said nothing further on the subject of the secret ingredient. She did, however, position herself slightly upwind for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, as the sun painted the allotments in shades of gold and amber, Ben approached his plots with June's mysterious concoctions. The smell hit him before he'd even unscrewed the first lid. The application process proved more challenging than anticipated, requiring him to breathe through his mouth while his eyes streamed. Over the following days, the results of June's family fertilizer became apparent. Ben's seedlings began exhibiting what could charitably be called vigorous response to nutrients. Within days, the seedlings lurched between sulking and sprinting, none of it quite normal. The third phase of Ben's education arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the academic exactness that had made Eleanor Vance the most feared and respected English teacher Little Mizzlewick Secondary had ever known. She approached with a battered book tucked under her arm. Practical Gardening by Moonlight, a complete guide to lunar planting, 1962 edition. "Ben," she said, adjusting her reading glasses with authority, "I've been researching your chili cultivation challenges. It seems your timing may be all wrong." She opened the book to reveal diagrams that looked like a cross between astronomical charts and horticultural battle plans. According to this, successful chili cultivation depends entirely on lunar phases. Your seedlings should have been transplanted during the 3rd quarter moon, but you can still save them if you act quickly. Eleanor's smile had the satisfaction of a teacher whose student was finally asking the right questions. "Tonight is the new moon. You'll need to repot them during the 3rd lunar phase. That's the night after tomorrow, but only after 11 p.m, when the moon's influence on nitrogen absorption reaches optimal levels, and you must whisper to them during the process." At precisely 11:15 p.m, 2 nights later, Ben crept through the village toward the allotments, armed with Eleanor's lunar wisdom and a determination to get his chili cultivation back on track. The village was entirely still at this hour, which Ben found both peaceful and slightly unnerving, as though Little Mizzlewick was watching him from behind its curtains. Working by headlamp while consulting lunar charts and attempting to maintain gentle conversation with confused pepper seedlings required a level of multitasking Ben hadn't anticipated. "There we go," he whispered to a particularly droopy ghost pepper plant as he eased it into fresh compost. "New pot, better drainage, perfect lunar timing. You're going to love it here." A rustling in the hedge made him pause. but the sound faded into the night. He was fairly certain it was a hedgehog rather than one of his neighbours with a notebook, but given recent experience, he couldn't be entirely sure. By the time he'd finished, it was nearly 1 a.m, and a dog had begun howling somewhere in the village, soon joined by others until it sounded like the entire canine population had decided to provide midnight commentary on his lunar gardening activities. The fourth and most melodically challenging piece of advice arrived on a lazy Sunday afternoon. Arthur Grimshaw ambled over from his own plot, settling onto an upturned crate with the satisfied grunt of someone who'd earned his Sunday rest. "Ben," Arthur said, his eyes twinkling with suppressed laughter, "I've been thinking about your chilies. All that military precision and lunar timing is well and good, but you might be missing the most important ingredient." Arthur's smile carried the weight of decades spent coaxing vegetables from reluctant soil. "Music, lad. Plants need music. My grandfather swore by it. Albert Grimshaw, finest gardener in 3 counties. His secret wasn't fancy fertilizers or precise schedules. He sang to everything he planted, said plants grew straighter when they had a tune to follow. Ben scribbled notes frantically, trying to capture the essence of what seemed like the most practical advice he'd received yet. Here was something he could actually implement without requiring military equipment or mysterious fertilizers or midnight lunar rituals. "What kind of songs work best?" he asked, already mentally reviewing his admittedly limited musical repertoire. Arthur chuckled, a sound as warm as Sunday afternoon sunshine. "That's the beauty of it, lad. Doesn't matter if you can carry a tune in a bucket. What matters is the intention, the connection. Plants respond to genuine care, whether it comes wrapped in perfect pitch or sounds like a cat being strangled." The next morning found Ben approaching his plots with new purpose and elevated self-consciousness, standing before his collection of increasingly eccentric pepper plants. He felt suddenly foolish, but Arthur's words echoed in his memory. Genuine care, human connection, the magic of intention wrapped in melody. He cleared his throat experimentally, glanced around to make sure he was unobserved, and began with a tentative rendition of "Here Comes the Sun." His voice, rusty from disuse and tight with embarrassment, wavered through the opening lines. "Here comes the sun, do-do-do-do." He sang softly to a Carolina Reaper that looked like it was having second thoughts about life. "Here comes the sun, and I say, it's all right." But as he continued, something seemed to shift. The morning air carried his words across the plots, and he found himself focusing on the plants themselves, these strange, struggling vegetables that he'd subjected to such experimental enthusiasm. It was only when he was packing up his equipment that he heard it, a low, mournful howling coming from somewhere behind the allotment sheds. The sound was joined by another voice, then another, until it seemed like every dog in Little Mizzlewick was participating in some sort of musical response to his agricultural serenade. The howling continued as he made his way to the gate, a canine chorus that seemed to echo his own vocal efforts with significantly more volume and arguably better pitch. By the time he reached the village green, the entire neighbourhood seemed to be alive with the sound of music. If music was the right word for what sounded like a community-wide dog opera. Ruth Henderson was standing in her garden, looking puzzled as Brandy the Spaniel contributed enthusiastic harmonies to the morning concert. Tom Armitage emerged from his cottage, scratching his head as his terrier performed what appeared to be a complex vocal solo. "Morning, Ben," Tom called, raising his voice over the musical chaos. "Lovely morning for singing, apparently." Ben waved cheerfully, trying to project the confidence of someone whose agricultural methods hadn't just triggered a village-wide canine musical festival. "Beautiful morning," he agreed, quickening his pace toward home. Behind him, the dogs continued their chorus, as though Ben's pepper serenade had awakened some deep musical instinct in every 4-legged resident of Little Mizzlewick. Over the following days, Ben's morning concerts became a regular feature of allotment life, accompanied by the village's canine population who'd established what appeared to be a regular schedule of musical accompaniment. By the 8th week, Ben had developed the most comprehensive pepper cultivation program in village history, combining military discipline, ancestral fertilizer, lunar timing, and musical encouragement. His plants responded by evolving into botanical anomalies that seemed to exist in their own peculiar ecosystem of confusion and overachievement. Operation Pepper Pot. By the 10th week of what Ben had started thinking of as Operation Pepper Pot, his plants had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. What had begun as ordinary chili seedlings had transformed under his enthusiastic care into botanical anomalies that seemed to exist in their own peculiar ecosystem. The Carolina Reapers had responded to military watering schedules, mysterious fertilizers, lunar transplanting, and daily serenades by growing into shapes that bore only passing resemblance to anything in the standard gardening catalogues. Some had apparently decided that traditional leaf patterns were suggestions rather than requirements. One particularly ambitious plant had grown to nearly 3 feet tall and was producing what looked less like peppers and more like angry red Christmas ornaments. The ghost peppers had taken a different approach, developing personalities, with each plant exhibiting distinct preferences for which songs they'd accept and which fertilizer applications they'd tolerate. One had grown in a perfect spiral, as though reaching towards some invisible celestial pepper god. Another had produced so many tiny peppers that it looked like it was covered in malevolent green fairy lights. But it was the Satan's blood supreme plants that had truly embraced the chaos. These had apparently decided that if they were going to be the hottest peppers in England, they might as well look the part. Some had grown to sizes that seemed physically impossible, while others had clustered together in formations that looked like tiny red grenades. "They're supposed to look like that," Ben insisted to anyone who would listen, though privately he was beginning to wonder if his peppers had crossed some sort of botanical event horizon. Eleanor approached him one morning with her notebook and barely contained scientific excitement. "Ben," she said, showing him sketches that looked like botanical illustrations from an alternate universe. "The results are unprecedented, though I'm curious about the intensity of their appearance. Those peppers are remarkably vibrant." As if summoned by their conversation, Major Burns appeared, conducting his morning inspection. He stopped before Ben's plots, his moustache twitching as he surveyed the agricultural anomalies. "Carter," he announced, "your peppers look like they're ready for combat." The first indication that enhanced safety measures might be required came during Ben's routine weekly harvesting session. He'd approached his first ripe Carolina Reaper with confidence, reaching out to pluck it from its stem with his usual gardening gloves. The moment his protected fingers made contact with the pepper, he felt a sensation that was less like touching a vegetable and more like grasping a tiny, malevolent coal. "Blimey," he muttered, hastily releasing the pepper and stepping back. That's quite warm." When he looked down at his gardening gloves, he noticed that the leather where he'd touched the pepper had developed a slightly darker patch. More concerning, his eyes were streaming tears, despite the fact that he'd barely touched the thing. Ben's protective equipment evolved weekly. First came rubber gloves over gardening gloves, then safety goggles after an incident left him temporarily blinded by pepper-induced tears. An apron followed, then a scarf wrapped around his nose and mouth, following an unfortunate incident where simply breathing near his ghost pepper plants had triggered what he preferred to think of as respiratory enthusiasm. By week 12, Ben's protective equipment had reached its final form. Industrial gloves over gardening gloves, safety goggles, respiratory protection, full coverage apron and tactical Wellington boots. The overall effect was striking. Other allotment holders had taken to referring to him as the allotment astronaut. Major Burns observed Ben's transformation with professional approval. "Excellent fieldwork preparations, Carter. Those peppers look like they could explode at any moment." June, maintaining her distance while deadheading roses that had begun drooping whenever the wind carried pepper essence in their direction, offered a practical assessment. "If he goes up in smoke," she murmured to Eleanor, "I want his wheelbarrow." Arthur found himself genuinely impressed by the unintended consequences of village helpfulness. "His singing's improved remarkably," he observed, "nothing like the threat of pepper-induced asphyxiation to motivate proper vocal projection." The local wildlife had developed its own relationship with Ben's agricultural experiment. Even the cats kept their distance, which told the villagers everything they needed to know. Leo had taken to filming from behind a blast screen, fashioned from an old pasting table propped against the fence, which he claimed was for camera stability. Nobody questioned this, partly out of politeness and partly because they had all quietly begun maintaining a similar distance themselves. Eleanor, who'd been documenting the entire process with academic thoroughness, had filled 3 notebooks with observations that read like a combination of botanical research and disaster preparedness manual. "The metamorphosis appears to be complete," she explained to Tom Armitage. "Subject has adapted to environmental challenges through systematic equipment enhancement and behavioural modification." As the cook-off date approached, the village seemed to hold its collective breath, watching as Ben continued his daily routine of armoured plant care and protective pepper harvesting. His plants had achieved their final form, a collection of vegetables that looked like they could power a small generator or clear an entire county of unwanted pests. Sarah Logan had started taking bets at the shop on whether Ben would survive his own cook-off entry. "Even Money says he needs medical attention within 5 minutes of tasting," she announced. Alfie Crane, who'd observed the whole enterprise from a discreet distance across 12 weeks of postal rounds, put £2 on 4 minutes and kept his reasoning to himself. Leo Turnbull had been documenting the process for his YouTube channel, which had gained significant subscriber growth thanks to what he'd dubbed the Great Pepper Experiment of Little Mizzlewick. His weekly updates featuring Ben in increasingly elaborate protective gear tending to progressively more dangerous-looking vegetables had attracted attention from across England. The anticipation had reached levels typically reserved for major sporting events. The question was no longer whether Ben's peppers would be the hottest in the competition. The question was whether they would be technically edible, legally permissible, or require hazardous materials certification. The Great Pepper Panic. The morning of the allotment, Society Chilli cook-off dawned clear and bright with crisp autumn air that usually promised perfect conditions for outdoor village events. Bunting fluttered between oak trees, and borrowed trestle tables had been arranged in festival formation. The mismatched crockery created a cheerful jumble that would have looked charming under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Word of Ben Carter's agricultural experiment had spread far beyond village boundaries, drawing visitors from neighbouring communities who'd heard rumours of peppers so hot they required protective equipment to harvest. The usual crowd of 30 had swollen to nearly 200 spectators, all eager to witness what was being advertised as either the greatest culinary challenge in rural England or the most spectacular food disaster ever recorded. Leo Turnbull had set up multiple camera angles and borrowed professional lighting equipment. His YouTube channel had temporarily been renamed Pepper Apocalypse Watch, and his subscriber count had jumped from 17 to over 3,000. Eleanor had established a scientific observation station positioned for optimal viewing while maintaining safe distance from potential pepper-related incidents. Her notebook was open, pen poised, wearing the expression of someone preparing to document either history or disaster. Dr. Thorne had arrived early with his medical bag within easy reach, having consulted colleagues about appropriate treatment for capsaicin poisoning and received advice that amounted to pray and provide lots of milk. He'd arranged for several emergency gallons to be on standby and had positioned himself, his bag, and a folding chair at what he privately calculated to be the optimal distance from the judging table, close enough to intervene, far enough to finish his tea first. The other contestants had set up their jams, relishes and stews with quiet confidence, filling the air with reassuringly ordinary aromas. And then there was Ben. He arrived wearing his full protective ensemble, carrying a sealed container that seemed to radiate heat despite being made of thick ceramic. The container was unremarkable, but the atmosphere around it shimmered slightly, as though Ben was transporting concentrated summer in portable form. "Morning, everyone!" Ben called cheerfully through his respiratory protection, setting his entry on the designated table with careful movements. "Beautiful day for a cook-off!" The assembled crowd took a collective step backward as Ben's container joined the other entries. Even sealed, it seemed to exist in its own microclimate of concentrated intensity. Somewhere near the back, Alfie Crane had positioned himself with a cup of tea and the equanimity of a man who had seen the whole thing coming since March. He did not step backward with the rest of the crowd. He had already been standing at what he privately considered the correct distance. Major Burns, who'd appointed himself head judge, despite having taste buds systematically destroyed by decades of military rations, surveyed the competition with professional interest. "Standard tasting protocol," he announced, consulting a clipboard. "Small portions, judges proceed from mildest to hottest, palate cleansers between entries, and will be taking special precautions with certain entries." He said this while looking directly at Ben's container in the tone of a man issuing a formal warning to a vegetable. The judging began with ceremonial gravity. Major Burns, flanked by Eleanor and Arthur, approached the first entry with the solemnity of generals reviewing battle plans. Mrs. Briggs's chili jam went down smoothly, earning approving nods about proper balance. Tom's beef chili prompted appreciative murmurs. June's pepper relish elicited respectful praise for family tradition. Then came Ben's turn. He approached his container with deliberate movements. The ceramic lid came off with a soft hiss, revealing what looked like concentrated, angry heat. "Carter's Inferno," Ben announced, ladling tiny portions onto the judges' spoons. 12 weeks of intensive cultivation. The judges accepted their portions and tasted simultaneously. The effect was immediate. Major Burns went rigid for exactly 3 seconds. Then his face turned an alarming shade of red. He produced a sound that was part cough and part surrender, dropping his spoon and reaching blindly for the nearest jug of milk. Eleanor, whose composure was usually unshakable, discovered that theoretical preparation was entirely useless against weaponized capsaicin. Her eyes watered profusely, her notes scattered, and she reached for her water glass with uncharacteristic haste. Arthur simply wheezed. His face crumpled into a mask of silent, breathless laughter as tears streamed down his cheeks. He reached for his pint of milk, missed, and had to lean against the trestle table for support. Dr. Thorne abandoned his tea and approached at a brisk, satisfied pace, deploying emergency dairy supplies like a battlefield medic. Ben stood beside his creation, watching the chaos with a mixture of horror and profound deflation. His peppers had exceeded every specification for heat, but they had comprehensively failed the fundamental test of being edible. The village had watched him pour his soul into these plants for 3 months, and he had nearly poisoned the judging panel. He quietly placed the lid back on the container. The crowd, seeing the judges recovering and the medical emergency downgraded to severe indigestion, began to laugh. It was not a cruel sound, but a collective release of tension that rippled across the village green. The warm ending. Later that evening, the heavy oak doors of the Shepherd's Crook closed against the damp autumn chill. The pub was pleasantly full, humming with the steady murmur of village postmortems. Ben sat at a corner table, staring into a half-empty glass of ale, feeling thoroughly foolish. His prized chilies had been safely disposed of in the village hall's commercial bins, wrapped in 3 layers of plastic. He expected sideways glances or whispered jokes. Instead, the pub went about its business exactly as it always did. Arthur Grimshaw wiped down the bar, his movements unhurried. He caught Ben's eye, filled a fresh pint glass, and walked over to the corner table. He set the glass down with a soft thud. "On the house," Arthur said, his voice measured and warm. "For services to village entertainment." Ben offered a weak smile. "I'm fairly sure I've voided Dr. Thorne's medical insurance." Arthur chuckled quietly, a sound that rumbled in his chest. My grandfather always said a man learns more from a spectacular failure than a mediocre success. You gave it your all, lad. Nobody can say you don't commit. Before Ben could reply, June Marsh appeared at his elbow. She did not say a word about lunar schedules or secret family fertilizers. She simply placed a small brown paper envelope on the table next to his pint. Ben looked down. Written in neat, sensible handwriting were the words, Ailsa Craig tomatoes. Start indoors. Water normally. Next season, June said briskly, her tone returning to its usual forthright setting. Try not to require protective equipment. She gave him a sharp, approving nod and walked back to her group. Ben looked from the seed packet to Arthur, who was already heading back to the bar, perfectly at home among the brass pumps and polished wood. The realization settled over Ben slowly. There would be no grand speeches or sudden declarations of belonging. The village did not work that way. They had let him make his mistakes. They had laughed at the resulting chaos. And now they had simply made room for him to try again. He picked up the seed packet, took a sip of his fresh pint, and finally felt the quiet, unmistakable warmth of coming home. The walk home from the Shepherd's Crook offered a perfect moment for quiet reflection. The pub firmly belonged to the central village cluster, and leaving its warm, amber-lit windows behind meant stepping into the crisp, damp air of the cobbled square. The village was completely still. St. Jude's Church, which faced the square directly, cast a long, protective shadow over the pavement. As Ben turned his collar up against the autumn chill, he realised he was no longer turning over the sting of his public failure. Instead, his pocket held a small brown envelope of tomato seeds, a silent peace offering from June Marsh. It was a perfectly British sort of acceptance, practical, unshowy, and completely devoid of fuss. He took the longer route home, wandering past the quiet shop fronts. Henderson's Butchers, run by Simon and Margaret, was dark, though Ben thought he spotted the shape of Barnaby, their ginger cat, patrolling the alleyway. The village felt distinctly lived in, a network of overlapping histories that he was finally beginning to understand. The next morning brought a pale, clear light that promised a crisp autumn day. Ben made his coffee, staring at the Ailsa Craig seed packet resting on his kitchen counter. He did not need military schedules or lunar charts for these. He simply needed to follow the instructions written in June's neat, sensible hand. Stepping out into the morning, Ben made his way back toward the village centre. He found Nora Field standing by the notice board on the outside wall of St. Jude's. Nora had kept the board in perfect order since her retirement from the post office nearly 30 years ago, treating it as a physical archive of the village's daily concerns. "Morning, Nora," Ben called, approaching without his industrial protective gear for the first time in weeks. Nora turned. Her gentle, open face broke into a smile of genuine amusement. She possessed the kind of village memory that noticed everything, and she had thoroughly enjoyed the previous day's drama. "Morning, Ben. I hear the commercial bins in the village hall had to be cordoned off for public safety."
Ben laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I believe Dr. Thorne recommended treating the area as a hazard zone. What are you putting up today?"
Nora stepped back to reveal the newest addition to the board. It was a simple white card, written in perfectly spaced lettering. It read, "Wanted, emergency milk donations for immediate restocking of the medical kit." Ben stared at the notice, then felt a deep, helpless laugh bubbling up in his chest. It was the perfect, absurd punctuation to his 12 weeks of botanical warfare. How long will that stay up there? Nora considered the question with the seriousness of someone who curated the village's collective history. "Oh, I think it has earned a permanent spot, right next to old Colonel Whitfield's lost dog notices. Some things simply become part of the local record, whether they mean to or not." She paused, her intelligent eyes twinkling. "Besides, we never know when a newcomer might try to cultivate weapons-grade produce again. Best to maintain our supplies." Still smiling, Ben left the square and walked down the gentle slope toward the edge of the village, heading for the allotments. The communal growing space was June Marsh's domain, but this morning it was occupied by Arthur Grimshaw. The heavy-set landlord was already at work among his sensibly proportioned root vegetables. Arthur looked up as Ben approached his own plot. The scorched earth where the terrifying Chillis had once stood now lay empty and peaceful. "Morning, lad," Arthur called, his measured, unhurried voice carrying easily over the neat rows. "Coming to assess the battlefield?" "Coming to plan the next campaign, actually," Ben replied, leaning against the wooden gate. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the brown paper envelope. "June has issued me with new orders. Tomatoes." Arthur leaned on his spade, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "Ailsa Craig's, I will wager." "Exactly that," Ben said. She included instructions. Start indoors. Water normally. I think that was her way of telling me to leave the stopwatch and the protective goggles at home. Arthur chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to settle comfortably into the crisp air. He was a steady, protective man, and his amusement was entirely without malice. "She is a practical woman, June. Excellent choice of crop. Though I should warn you, if you need any advice on tomato cultivation, my grandfather always swore by a very specific brand of seaweed extract." Ben laughed, imagining another year of well-meaning guidance from his adopted community. "I will keep that in mind, Arthur, but maybe I will try following just one piece of advice at a time next season." "Now, where is the fun in that?" Arthur asked, returning to his digging with a satisfied air. Ben looked out over the allotments, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of a quiet English morning. A male marmalade cat, undoubtedly Cinders from the nearby station, was picking his way delicately along the top of a stone wall. The village had let him make his mistakes. They had laughed at the resulting chaos, and they had caught him when he stumbled. His peppers might have been a catastrophic failure, but they had achieved something far more valuable. They had finally made him a part of Little Mizzlewick.
Thank you for listening to the Little Mizzlewick Pepper Panic. I hope you enjoyed this small visit to the allotments, where ambition, advice, and village enthusiasm grew rather more vigorously than expected. I'd love to know whether you would have dared taste one of Ben's chilies, or whether you'd have quietly left that honour to someone else. A Little Mizzlewick story from Once Otherwhere, where small stories have big hearts,